All right, so today we are going to jump into our first real topic of the semester. Last time was just kind of an overview. This time is going to be getting into the first real meat of the semester. So the topic today is eliminative materialism. Now, as this word eliminative suggests, well, what word does this look like? It's the adjective form of what? What would be the verb?
Eliminate.
Elimination. Yeah, eliminate or elimination. What is it to eliminate something or for elimination to take place?
In this case, probably is disprove.
Yeah, so it's disprove, or speaking more generally, just throwing out. Like if you eliminate your garbage, it's a fancy way of saying you're throwing out your garbage. Or if like a sniper squad eliminates the enemy, they take out the enemy. So in this case, we're going to be talking about a type of eliminating. So if we're talking about a sort of eliminating, the obvious question is what? Well, if you're eliminating something, the question is, what are you eliminating? So the topic today is going to be about eliminative materialism and talking about what eliminative materialism is, what it's eliminating, and what people have argued, or what some of the reasons people have given to think eliminative materialism is right. And then next class, we'll talk about some responses to that. And so so I think rather than jumping into what, because it's a sort of eliminativism, which is a very hard word to say, and basically because it's going to be throwing out something, to understand the view, it's useful to start by asking what's it throwing out. And so what eliminativism is going to throw out is common sense, or our everyday thought of psychology. And so what eliminativists think is psychology as a field shouldn't exist, and really it should be replaced by something else. So that's going to be the general big picture thing. But what exactly does that entail? And what is this common sense view of psychology? And a little bit of that. Generally, the idea of our common sense view of psychology is psychology, like every other field. Generally, we start with common sense. So for instance, in physics, physicists haven't always been working with very complicated things. They began with just what their eyes were telling them. And from there, they started coming up with more and more complicated theories. So for instance, if you use, back in the old days, back like 2,000, 3,000 years ago, what did physicists say explained why this marker fell? What was it that caused it? Anyone know?
Gravity.
So even before, so gravity is now what we say. But before people started talking in terms of gravity, anyone have any ideas what they said? It was something very straightforward, like objects desired to fall, or they had things where they wanted to fall, or they were imbued with an essence of fallingness. And that's why people thought like, oh yeah, why do things fall? Well, they wanted to fall. That's how the world worked. That's what our eyes told us. And then over time, people have realized, wait, that doesn't work. Because if we go off in space, things don't fall. Why is that the case? Or if you were to create a force all around something, like and if you put something small enough surrounded by enough magnets, it won't fall anywhere. So what is going on here? So in the same way, psychologists generally start with our common sense view of what psychology is and why things do what they do. And then from there, they move forward to try to come up with a more complicated view of the world. And so what eliminativists are going to say is, we should throw out this project entirely. Instead of trying to take our common sense views and then make them better, what we're instead going to do is just start over from scratch. So to understand why they think this, let's talk about what the common sense psychology is, or what our everyday views are. Mikhail, did you have something you wanted to say? I cut you off about a minute and a half ago, I think.
I just want to say that it was against the folk psychology, which didn't change like for the last 2,000 years, and probably that was about the propositional attitudes. So if we want X, then we just gonna do Y, like Y or something like that.
Those are the key. These are the key words I want you all to pick up. So folk psychology or common sense psychology. And those are really used interchangeably. But the key idea is these things called propositional attitudes. Now, what do we mean by propositional attitudes? Rather than giving a definition, let's just look at this example. So look at my beautiful artistic creation. Based on this beautiful artistic creation, Anyone describe what is happening in this situation? Anyone think? So we've got this here, this, down here. Imagine this is an X-ray view in through the car door so you can see what's going on inside. And then we have this guy. What is going on in this little scene?
You got a guy just saw a deer and he's slamming onto the brakes to try not to hit the deer.
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on here. So what we have is his foot moves, he sees a deer, and he screams. So how in your everyday description, like what explains this? What sorts of things would we say that explains this scene? We could give a physical description of foot moves, car slows down, object appears. But really, what would we say? What would we describe this guy doing? Well, he sees a deer. Why does that matter? What's going on inside his head?
He's gonna just avoid the crash with the
He
deer.
doesn't want to hit the deer, or he wants to avoid the crash. So we have a wants to avoid deer. Now, there are other things that go into it. So for instance, he sees the deer. Why is that significant? Well, something as simple as he thinks there's a deer here. So he wants to avoid the deer. He thinks there's a deer. Also, he also believes or thinks that slamming his foot onto the brake will help him avoid the deer. So these are all sorts of things that we can explain his behavior. Also, why doesn't he just stay still? Well, we all think that he believes that if he does nothing, his car will smash into the deer. And so we can explain this little guy's behavior. Also, something as simple as, why is he swearing? Well, because he believes that he's in a stressful situation, or he thinks he's in danger. All of this is perfectly ordinary, every day. He's acknowledging that he needs to brake. Sorry, Alexia, my back was to the thing, so I just saw yours. So yeah, all of these are the things that are going through his head. And if we're going to explain this in our everyday life, this is what we're going to do. And we have these sorts of situations all the time. This is our number one way of explaining people's behavior. Why are you all here? Well, you all believe you have class, and you all want to pass the class. So these notions, believing, desiring, wanting, hoping, suggesting, thinking, all of these are what we call propositional attitudes. Now, I have to get rid of my beautiful art, which I probably spent 6 minutes drawing before class. So I just want that on the record, that this was a project of love. Anyway, so a propositional attitude. So these things of belief, desire, hope, intend, want, fear. Basically, all of these are what are we call, let me just erase this up here, propositional attitudes. And now this is the fancy term of just referring to all these sorts of things together. Now, what can we say about these things a little bit more? Well, in most cases, we can write them out or describe them using a sentence like so and so believes, hopes, etc., that blank. And so the way you identify a propositional attitude is usually in English, and most languages have forms like this. I'm going to talk in terms of language because it's a little simpler. There are things that you have so-and-so, attitude word, that, something else. And usually this is a full sentence. So he believes that there's a deer in front of him. He hopes that there's a car that's going to pick him up. She worries that her mother is sick. Those are all what we mean by propositional attitudes. And so the way you can think of these is they involve a relationship between a person or like an attitude holder. So in our common sense sort of way, so we have students, and then we have the attitude word. a connection word of that, and then we have this other thing, a proposition. Now, a proposition is just a fancy way of saying something that can be true or false. So a proposition is something like that the sky is blue, that one's true, or that Donald Trump is still the president, that one's false. So a proposition is just this thing that is capable of being true and false, that we can think, we can say, we can believe. Now, I'm being kind of fuzzy here because what a proposition actually is one of the like really up in the air things. But the best way to think about it is it's something that represents the way the world is or represents a state of affairs that could be true. So something like that Trump is still the president, whatever a proposition is, it represents the state of the world that would have to be the case for it to be true that Trump is still the president. Now, I recognize that this sort of stuff is fancy, big picture things. Basically, what you can think of them as is just the contents of your thoughts. When a person believes something, the proposition is what they believe. When a person hopes something, a proposition is what they hope. So why are we talking in terms of propositions and some mysterious thing rather than just saying, you know, the thing someone believes? Well, it's because one of the reasons we think and talk in this way is that different people can have the same relation to the same proposition, or different people can have different relations to the same content or the same proposition. So you can think of a proposition just as the content of a mental state, a content of a thought. It can also be the content of a sentence expression. So when I say Donald Trump is still the president, or I say, no, Donald Trump is not still the president, there's a content that I'm saying. And the reason we talk in terms of propositions is so we can explain things like arguments and we can explain things like communication. So how do conspiracy theories spread? Well, you've got one person who comes up with their conspiracy theory. Then what they do, in their head, they have there's a proposition that they have a belief about. So they believe this conspiracy theory. And then what they do is they open their mouth and they say some words, and those words have the meaning of the conspiracy theory. And then somebody else hears those words, and then the conspiracy theory gets into their head, and maybe this person doubts it. So what we can say is there's one content, whatever the conspiracy theory is, say that Hillary Clinton is running a child pedophilia ring out of her basement. This person believes it. These words mean that, and this person doubts it. And we can explain all of that just in terms of the one single content. And so that's the kind of the core idea of our common sense way of thinking about how thinking works. We have contents, we in some sense grasp these contents, and then we form some attitude about them. It can be a belief, it can be a desire, it can be a want, etc. So on one hand, everything I just said is incredibly complicated and long-winded, and on another hand, it's very simple because this is generally the way you think about thinking. Like if your two friends are having an argument and you turn to a third friend and go, what are they arguing about? And you say, well, so-and-so believes that Tom Brady is the best quarterback ever, and so-and-so believes that Tom Brady is not the best quarterback ever. That Tom Brady is the best quarterback ever is the proposition, and they are having a disagreement about what attitude you should hold towards that proposition. So just fancy terminology on top of everyday ways of thinking. So does this make sense to everyone? Like pretty generally, and again, we're going to be talking about this all semester, and we're going to be unpacking this more, but this is generally our everyday understanding of how thinking works. There's one other thing I want to say about this part, the attitudes. These are generally defined functionally, and this is something we're going to come back to again and again this semester, which is a notion of something being functional. Functional definitions or understood functionally. What does functional mean, or what is a function? And I mean this not in a like complicated like, I'm not asking you about psychology, I'm just asking you in your everyday sense. If I were to ask what's its function, what am I talking about?
How it works.
How it works, and also not just how it works, but what it's working towards. So a functional definition is defining something in terms of what it's supposed to do. And that's in terms of both how it works and what it's designed to do. So there are some things in the world that are defined in terms of their essence. So something like, what is it to be a human being? Well, generally we think of it as having a certain type of DNA and having a certain evolutionary history, etc. What is it to be a mousetrap, though? What is it to be a mousetrap? What makes something a mousetrap?
It's something that's intended to. Oops.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, you can go.
All right. So yeah, it's just something. Its goal is to trap a mouse. Does it matter what it's made out of? No. You have glue traps. You have those little backbreaker traps. You can call your cat a mouse trap if it's very well skilled. I mean, if you get a stick and a book and put some peanut butter on the stick so that the mouse runs into the stick and it falls and the book crushes the mouse, also a mouse trap. All it is to be a mouse trap is for it to trap a mouse. So the idea here is, what is it to be a particular attitude? Well, to believe something is just to stand in a particular functional relationship, namely the believing relationship to this content. So all that separates a belief that a certain proposition is true from a desire that a certain proposition is true. So you could have one person who believes that Donald Trump is still the president, somebody else who desires Donald Trump to still be the president. What they differ in is what their relationship to that content is. One of them is tempted, in a belief case, you're tempted to still treat it as true, to act as if it's true and use that in your everyday life. So if somebody were to ask you, who's the president? You'd say Donald Trump. If you desired it to be the case, you'd know it's false, but you wish that it had been true. So all of these things are defined functionally. Now, this raises an obvious question of what is a belief versus what is a desire? What is it to believe something? And short answer, there's not a clear answer. And we're going to come back to this later in the semester. But so like, what is it to believe that something's true? Well, you can kind of give like a first pass. It's to think and treat something as true in your further thought. But there's no clear-cut definition right now. What is it to hope that something's the case? Well, it's to kind of want, but so you can see it's hard to define these things, but that's generally our everyday idea. And again, this tracks with common sense. The common sense view is when you hope that you get something great for your birthday, there's a content there, and what it's doing is that you stand in some sort of hoping relationship. And when you hope that's the case, you behave differently than when you doubt it's the case. So if you doubt that you're going to get something nice for your birthday, you're more likely to maybe buy a nice thing for yourself. And so the same content and explaining behavior is a combination of what the content you're thinking about is and how you're thinking about it. All right, let me take a break here. That got a little bit more long-winded than I wanted it to. But is everyone generally on board with what we're talking about here in terms of what our common sense view of how we think works and the way we can use these big, unnecessarily long philosophical words to describe what's basically common sense? All right, so I'm going to erase this now because this view right here, what I just described, is the view that eliminative materialists deny. Eliminative materialists say that if we want to have a science of the mind and explain behavior and everything else, we need to throw all of this out. Everything needs to go. We need something completely new. Psychologists who are not eliminative materialists think that, no, this is where we start. And as we do more science and we do more work, we'll have to change some things. Maybe the English word belief doesn't correspond perfectly to how the mind works, but maybe there's something similar enough. Well, the eliminative materialist says, no, it all has to go. You just erase the entire board and we start talking in an entirely new way. And if you want to explain why human beings or anything else does what it does, you need to use entirely different terminology. So, anyone have any thoughts for what, any guesses or based on the reading, what eliminative materialists think, or what is going to replace our common sense psychology? When we start doing real science, what are we going to have to turn to? If we're not ever going to talk about beliefs, desires. Mikhail?
Neurobiology.
Yeah, neuroscience and neurobiology. And neurobiology, which basically means everything that you think you're explaining in terms of beliefs and desires, once we have actual science and not this wishy-washy crap, it's just going to be talking about brains and brain activation and brain locations and which part of the brain activates and how much it activates and what neurotransmitters are released. And so their idea is that throw out everything else. Instead of saying, why did that person slam on the brakes? They thought there was a deer there. You'll say something like, why did that person slam on the brakes? Well, there was activation in the left motor cortex, which led to, or there was a perceptual input from their eyes, which led to activation and release of cortisol through the nervous system, and a triggering of activation in the left side of the motor cortex, which caused their right foot to slam on the brakes. Now, it's going to be much more complicated than that, but that's the sort of explanation they're going to give. Now, what is the motivation? Why should we think that beliefs and desires are bad? Well, why is it that eliminative materialists think this? Well, there's basically 3 different reasons that they think at the end of the day, we need to get rid of common sense and replace it with other things. So their first reason for it, if anyone wants to take a stab from memory of the readings or wants to guess what some of these are, feel free. Mostly I just need a sip of water, and so no pressure to come up with something, but I need a sip of water.
Well, they said it's been stagnant for a long time.
So yeah, one of them is, I'm gonna put that up here as, actually no, let's go in the order in which you all bring them up. 1.
First, every theory can be disproved.
So yeah, so the first, actually, the first thing to say is, so before I get to Grace's point, which is stagnant, there's kind of this background point 0. And this is the one
so
that,
this is the folk psychology is the theory. So
yeah, the first thing they say is, first off, you might think that you can't get rid of folk psychology. Like, we have direct access to it. We know it's true. We know our own beliefs. So we can't get rid of it. And the first thing that the church, so a little background on eliminative materialism. Just as a sociological fact, there are 2 main people who are associated with eliminative materialism within cognitive science and psychology. It is Paul and Patricia Churchland. And now, as you might be able to tell from this, they are a married couple, which is just like a funny fact. Like the 2 main people who hold this view happen to be a married couple, both of whose names start with P. So if you're reading through the literature on this stuff, people generally just talk about them as the Churchlands because most articles are just P. Churchland, and it's too much work to figure out which one wrote it, and they have very similar views. So that's just a random fun fact. But yeah, the Churchlands first want to say, and this was the article we read was by Paul Churchland, but the first thing they say is, no. It's not the case that we know for certain that folk psychology is true. We can't just say it's something that we have perfect access to. It's not like we can look inside other people's minds and see their beliefs, and we can't see their desires. Rather, what we do is we see what they're doing, and then we theorize using these common sense terms like belief and desire, and then try to impose that, explain things as kind of a best explanation sort of approach. We say, oh, we see what they are doing, and one way to explain this is in terms of these common sense notions. But that's just a theory. There's no guaranteed proof of that. And this is even the case with our own thoughts or our own feelings. So we often like to think that we have perfect access to what's going on inside our own head. Like, I know exactly what I'm thinking right now. I know what I'm believing right now. But is that really the case? How many of you have had the experience where somebody comes up to you and they're like, you're being really cranky right now, you know that? And your response is something like, no, I'm not. I'm not being cranky. I'm not cranky at all right now. And then you eat a sandwich and then you realize afterwards, like, oh yeah, I was cranky, wasn't I? I was really cranky. We'll talk about being hangry a lot this semester because it's kind of a funny sort of thing. And it's actually something I want to talk about again in a second. So, and we can also think of times in which somebody's like, yeah, I wasn't nervous. How many of you have had this experience? You say, I'm not nervous about it. It's not bothering me at all. And then you like hear back. So you're like, I'm not nervous about getting into this college. I have no worries about it at all. I'm just going along my merry way. You know, it doesn't really matter to me. And then you find out that you got in and you're just like, oh my God, thank God. I had no idea how about this I was. Like, I feel like this is a rather, or it can be any sort of thing, like you wait to hear back from a doctor and you're like, yeah, I'm not nervous about what they have to say. And then you find out that you're fine. And you're like, I really was nervous, wasn't I? And so this is also a way in which the churchlings are just saying, we don't have perfect access to what's going on inside. Even with our own behaviors, there's a sort of, we're just theorizing to best explain our our like feelings, our sensations, our emotions. We're just doing the best we can. So the first step that they say is, first off, folk psychology is a theory that is capable of being wrong. It's not something like math where it makes no sense to even call it into question. Like as soon as you say, but is 2 + 2 really 4? Like communication breaks down, just exit the math class and just go on your merry way because there's no point talking anymore. They want to say, no, we can still have communication and good thinking if we deny folk psychology, because folk psychology is just a theory. Then what they want to say is, so that's the first step, is one, it can be wrong. Now what Churchland tries to do is say, and here's reason to think not only that it can be wrong, this is reason to think it is wrong. And so one of the things he brings up is that it's stagnant. So what does it mean for something to be stagnant?
It's not progressing or evolving.
Yeah, it's still, it hasn't moved forward. And so what his argument is here is if you look at other science, what we've found is that if you look at what the world looked like 2,000 years ago, the only, talk about physics again, we used to think that this marker wanted to fall. We now know that it's got something, then someone came along and said, actually, there's this invisible force gravity, and gravity pulls it down. And then Einstein came along and actually said that mass warps space-time and all sorts of crazy things, and really what gravity is the effects of a warped space-time by a collection of mass, and at this point I'm just bullshitting because I don't understand physics. But that's the general gist. And that is true progress moving forward. But if you go back and read ancient literature, what you find is the explanations that people give for behaviors are basically the exact same things we have today. So if you go back and read like the Iliad, why is it that Achilles decides to go on a killing rampage? He's mad. He's just really mad. Why is it that Odysseus wants to get home? Well, because he loves his wife, and he loves his homeland. These are the exact same explanations we still give today. And so what Churchland wants to say is like, if you look at a real science, things progress, we make progress. You look at folk psychology, we're still using the exact same terms we did 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. This isn't progress. This is just a common sense sort of view that we have made no progress on whatsoever. This isn't something we should save. It's not doing anything for us. So that's the first thing he wants to say about it. Anyone have an idea what his second thing was? And actually, it's not even just that there's, let me just follow this up. It's not even that it's just stagnant. It's that it moves backward. If anything, it's gotten worse, and the explanatory power that we have from folk psychology has gotten lesser over the years. So if you go back a few thousand years ago, why does it rain? Why is there a thunderstorm? What did people think was the cause of these things?
Probably Zeus.
Yeah, Zeus, or basically the gods were happy or the gods were mad. It was their desires, their beliefs. And so we used to explain the weather using folk psychology, and people, and the sea, and all these different things. And what we've seen is actually, so if everything used to be explained in this way, well, first off, we got rid of the weather. Now we explain that in a different way. And we explain like why things drop. That goes into physics. So now the things that we explain in folk psychology are even smaller. At one point, chemistry and chemical ideas were explained in terms of something like psychology. It had to do with alchemy and the internal souls that were in all inanimate objects. So those have gotten smaller. And we used to explain. So basically what Churchland wants to say, it's not only that it's stagnated. If you actually look, folk psychology is explaining less and less and less of the world over time. So it's even, if anything, it's going backwards and losing progress. All right. So then the next thing he wants to say is, it's not just that it's stagnated. And it's not just that it hasn't moved forward, and if anything has gone backwards. There's also so much about what we want to explain tied in with the mind that folk psychology has nothing to say about. It seems like we can explain a very, very small subset of the things that we want to talk about in psychology. So what are some things that folk psychology, common everyday discussions, cannot explain? Anyone have any? Marie?
I think in the reading, it said sleep was one of the things we still can't explain.
Yeah, there are a lot of things. So things we can't explain. And folk psychology cannot explain, like, why do we dream? Or why do we have different sleep stages? Why is it that our eyes move around when we're sleeping in REM cycles? Well, you can't do it in terms of folk psychology. What? Why did you sleep? How does sleeping work? Well, I wanted to sleep. What? Why did you dream? What caused your dream? Well, I desired to dream. I thought about it. Just doesn't explain it. How were you able? Why is it that some nights you fall asleep quickly and other nights you don't? Folk psychology has nothing to say on this. What are some other sorts of things that folk psychology has nothing to say about?
The learning process.
Yeah, the learning process.
Especially in children and animals.
Yeah, this is a really good one. So we've got sleep, learning. So how is it that, how many of you have spent time around children? Hopefully all of us have at some point. When you're dealing with the little buggers, like at one point they do nothing, and then within a year they do all this incredible stuff. How does that work? We can't just be like, why did the baby walk? Well, it wanted to. Well, that doesn't give you any explanation. How does the baby know how to walk? How did it get from crawling to like cruising around on surfaces to walking? Well, it looks like to explain this, it's something else. Another, Julie says our brains are still awake and active while we're asleep. And this is something else that like cannot be captured in a purely common sense sort of way. Like you can't even explain what a dream is using common sense psychology. Like, how do you differentiate between a dream, like when you're in a dream, you have beliefs about the dream, and you can give a nice explanation of what's the difference between a dream and not dreaming using brain talk, but you can't do it in terms of common sense. Other sorts of things are things like, there are a lot of cases in which you can explain things like, why are you angry? In terms of common sense. Like, why are you angry? Well, I don't know, they cheated on me. That sort of case, easy explanation. But there's lots of other cases, like a case like being hangry. And do you know what I mean by being hangry? It's angry because you're so hungry, your blood sugar's low, and you're a total grump. This is a case in which, like, why is it that you're being a grump right now? Well, it's because your blood sugar is low. This is not something that's explained in terms of folk psychology. This is something that's explained entirely in terms of physical differences. So, and in case you're wondering, this is kind of a tangent, but it's about anger, and it's one of my favorite psychology studies that's been done in like the last 50 years. So allow me to go sideways here. And this is a good case of something that folk psychology cannot explain. And we have a good explanation, though, if we go with biology. So parole judges. What is parole? This is, not in the case of psychology. This is like every day. Conrad.
You're no longer in jail, but you have somebody watching over you, making sure you're abiding by the laws of society.
Yeah, it's basically halfway between being in jail and being completely free. So very often, if you go to jail and if you behave well in jail, they will give you a hearing with a judge. They will tell the judge, like, this is what you've done well in prison. This is a sign that you're ready to go back into the world a little earlier than your sentence. And the judge will decide, all right, given your circumstances, I will allow you back into the real world, but you have to check in with it like a police officer specially designed on occasion. And if they decide, like, no, you aren't ready to go back into the world, then that's that. So, intuitively thinking, and on a folk psychology view, what's the number one thing that should determine whether a person gets parole or not? If folk psychology is right, what should be the determiner on the judge's behalf? The judge sits there, they hear the case, and then they give their conclusion.
Something like conscience.
It should be their conscience. They should take how did you behave? What did you do? What did you think? And yet, if they then did this study, and here is what a day in the life of a parole judge looks like. So you get to the office at like 9, and then you go until noon. At noon, you have a little lunch break until 1. And then from I think that you go until like 4, and then there was a little snack break, and then you go again from like 5 to 6. And so if you imagine this is the time, and then over here, you've got what percentage of people get parole. So here's 0%, here's 100%. This is what the chart looks like when you actually look at what percentage of people get parole. It looks like this. If you get your case heard early in the morning, right after the parole judge eats breakfast, there's a 50% chance you get parole. Within an hour before their lunch break, it drops to 10%. And in the 10 minutes before lunch, it's practically 0%. This was an actual study done with parole judges. I think it was done in Israel. But here's basically, so if you want to get parole, what's the best thing to do? Well, make sure that the judge just ate. Bring them a snack. That's your best chance of getting parole. It's nothing about your behavior. It's nothing about that. Just make sure they're not hungry. This is a case in which like folk psychology just straight up fails. It cannot account for this. Folk psychology would say if it was a good argument here and you had these beliefs, it should be all the way across. This is something folk psychology doesn't capture. Other things are things like brain damage cases. So how many people, those of you who are psych majors have probably heard of this charming fellow, Phineas Gage. I think that's how you spell his name. How many people have heard of Phineas Gage? Any takers? Okay. Who was he? What's his story? Why does he come up in every introductory psych class ever?
He basically was like, I think like a construction worker or something, and then like a metal pole went through his brain, and he was able to survive, but like a lot of people who knew him said like his behavior changed after the surgery.
Yeah, so basically he was working, it was back in the, I want to say late early 1900s. He was a construction worker. There was dynamite involved, and it blew a metal pipe straight through his head. So imagine somebody with like a big metal pipe sticking out of their head. They put him into surgery, and he miraculously survived. And he was still able to function, but his personality completely changed. Everyone who knew him beforehand had said he was like a loving father who was always on time, and then all of a sudden he became a complete flake with a gambling problem. What's the explanation for this? Well, he had a pipe through his head that physically broke parts of his brain. This is something that is easy to explain neuroscientifically. Explaining it in terms of folk psychology, it just doesn't work that well. What do you say? Phineas Gage got a pipe through his head and now he wanted to change he had new desires and new values? Well, it seems like, okay, that is what happened, but that doesn't tell you how it happened. What you need to know is which part of the brain did the pipe go through? Which part of his life memories were wiped out? So these are the sorts of things that the Churchlings say, stuff like this is so much of psychology that if we just stick to the belief, desire, feelings, our beliefs, desires, propositional attitudes, we're missing so much of what psychologists want to explain, so much so that it's really a useless theory. It doesn't explain nearly as much as we like to think it does. Yeah, we can cover like a case in which somebody slams on the brakes, big deal. I, a neuroscientist, once neuroscience is completed, will be able to explain why the brakes were slammed on and also explain hanger and how learning works and what sleep is and why Phineas Gage with the pipe through his head started behaving completely differently. You can't do any of that. We here in neuroscience will eventually be able to give an account of that. And unlike folk psychology, which has been the same for 2,000 years, neuroscience is getting better and better and better all the time as we get new tools and new materials. You know, we didn't used to have functional MRIs that work so well. Now we do, and we're learning all sorts of new things. So that's the background of the first two reasons that the Churchlings say we should get rid of folk psychology. It doesn't explain, it doesn't move forward, and there's so much it doesn't explain. There's one more thing that they want to talk about. Anyone know what this one was? I'm going to erase these ones here just so we have a little more room. Okay, I'll just put I don't know how to spell this word, so we aren't going to play Hangman. All right, I put up the word reducible. So first off, this is a term from science, reducible. What's the word that lies at its core? Well, reduce. So what is it for one thing to reduce to another, or for one thing to be reduced? You can either give the scientific definition of one science being reducible to another, or you can give the everyday comment, what is one thing to reduce?
Netflix reduced the number of DVD players.
Yeah, it's just to make it go down or to make it smaller. So what is it for something to be reducible? Well, in the scientific context, yeah, being simplified, lower, lessen, shrink. These are all what we mean by reducible. In a scientific context, what it means is you take one thing and then explain and say, ultimately, at the end of the day, this thing that we're giving an account of is actually ultimately going to be explained by a more fundamental science. So generally the way it goes is like this. Well, we've got biology. What does biology explain? What does biology talk about?
Life.
Life. And then we ask, what is life? Well, at the end of the day, when you went into, for those of you who took, one thing being explained by another or being described in terms of another or ultimately reducing to another. So when you took a chemistry or when you took a biology class, I'm sure we all did, and everyone remember there was a whole lot of stuff about like, you know, this little creature inside your cell would do this little thing, and to activate it, the RNA would yada, yada, yada. And a lot of times when they talk about the potassium and sodium levels moving across the cell wall and yada, yada. So at the end of the day, all organisms are made out of cells. And how do cells work? Well, it's explained in terms of things like sodium, potassium, etc. Where do we talk about sodium and potassium and things like that? What class?
Chemistry.
Yeah, they're talked about in chemistry. So the idea is at the end of the day, biology is ultimately just a matter of chemistry, because the things you talk about in biology, cells, etc., are made up of molecules, and those molecules are the things which together explain the biological processes. But then chemistry isn't the end of the day, because let's go back. What are atoms made out of? Well, molecules are made of atoms, and then what are atoms made out of?
Protons, neutrons,
electrons, all that crap. And then what is an electron though? Well, it's like a charge of, it's a cloud of electrified energy. And what is electrics and electrified energy and little pieces of matter and all this crap? Well, that's in physics. So if chemistry is, well, you work with atoms, well, that all breaks down into physics. And specifically, physics of like atomic parts and forces and etc. And ultimately physical parts, then they never teach you about quarks and I don't even understand what they are. But once you get down to it, then the atoms become the proton, neutron, electron, but then the protons and the neutrons are made up out of quarks, and the quarks might be made out of strings, and strings are described in terms of string theory, according to which there are like 47 dimensions of time and space, and none of it makes any sense to a human mind. But the idea is that every little bit is going to be reducible to another bit. So biology is explainable in terms of chemistry. Chemistry can be explained in terms of physics. And so everything bottles out in terms of physics. Then you could do something like above biology. You could put something like sociology. So human society ultimately comes down to what our biological needs are and how those biological needs interweave with a larger society. So there's this view amongst many scientists that everything ultimately bottoms out in terms of something else. Now, we'll come back to whether this is true at some point. We won't be talking about it too much. If you ever take a philosophy of science class, this becomes a major issue. But the churchlings want to say, it's at the very least quite plausible to think that everything reduces to a more simple science. So that's the first thing. The second thing you then say is, and where in the world do we put folk psychology in here? Where does folk psychology fit in? Well, in folk psychology, we've got these things, beliefs, and we've got these propositions. Well, where's a proposition? Like, propositions aren't subatomic particles. We said there's some weird thing that you can think of and I can think of, and they can be true or false. You know, atoms aren't true or false. They're atoms, and they're made of quarks. And chemistry, you've got positive and negative in terms of electrical charge, but you don't have true and false. Biology, you've got life and living things and reproduction, but you don't really have room for representation or things being true or false. So where in this big picture do we put folk psychology? And what the churchlings want to say is there's no room for it. If you want real science, it needs to ultimately be reducible. So what we need to do is, if we want to explain human behavior in a scientific way, get rid of the folk psychology and just insert the neuroscience about here. So that's what we're going to end up doing. If we want real science, we need to get rid of this common sense view. We need to go and explain things in terms of neuroscience that corresponds and can be integrated with the other sorts of science. You can explain the shape of a neuron in terms of electrical charge. You can explain it in terms of neurotransmitters. You can explain it ultimately in terms of physics. But you can't do that with a belief or desire. Those things don't break down into neuroscientific explanations that can be broken down into chemistry and biology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the three arguments that the churchlings have. They say, look, one, folk psychology is stagnant. If anything, it's moving backwards. The fact that we're hanging on to this thing, which is just a theory, we're just hanging on to it in the same way people used to explain things in terms of witches. You know, why was it that your crops failed? Well, your neighbor was a witch. You know, the witch did it. And then somebody came along and said, you know, there are no witches. We should get rid of witch theory. And to be clear, witch theory was actually quite a complicated theory in the medieval times. Like, there was a lot of theology and thoughts about witches, and there were tests to tell if somebody was a witch. There was theorizing that if you were a witch, there was some process that you went through with a deal with the devil, and then some parts of you became made out of wood, and because you were made out of wood, you would float. So the best way to test whether someone was a witch was you threw her, almost always women, into a lake, and if she floated, she was a witch and had to be burned, and if she wasn't a witch, she'd sink, and then you'd hope you could pull her out before she drowned. This is actual crazy things that our European ancestors did. But like these tests, there were very strict rules about how many priests had to be there and who could do these things. Like, it was not a we think back and they were just like, oh, witch did it. There was all this sophistication around it. So what the churchlings want to say is we don't know witches are incredibly, like, witch theory is wrong and was evil in so many ways. And therefore, like, we've seen theories can be thrown out when they don't have any explanatory power. And folk psychology has not led to many people being burned at the stake, but it is still a stagnant theory that can be wrong, gets a lot of things wrong, just like witch theory can't explain why sometimes your crops fail when your neighbor's mad at you and why it doesn't in other times. Well, in the same way, folk psychology can't explain things. And finally, witch theory wasn't reducible to other things. You just, at the end of the day, had to hold it and say magic. What seems like, at least according to the churchlings, it's something similar with folk psychology. All you have to, you can't talk in terms of neuroscience. You can't talk about these other things. You just have to throw up your hands and say, well, I guess it's just the propositional attitudes. So does everyone understand how this sort of structure is supposed to go, how this argument goes? So the only thing I want to do now is just briefly describe then, and I did it a little bit, how then will a eliminative materialist describe what a person is doing? Or, you know, going back to that initial car case, what is it they say is going on? Well, their explanation is just going to be in terms of brain firings, electrical currents, which part of the brain is being activated at what time, how many milliseconds afterwards there's charges of different amounts. And so at the end of the day, that's all that it's going to be. Now, they recognize that neuroscience is nowhere near being able to give a complete picture of this. Neuroscience is still an infant science in a lot of ways. Our technologies are just getting better and better because in many cases, we're talking about fractions of a fraction of a second difference of activations in different parts. And also, it's very hard to activate just certain areas of the brain. And there's so much is happening in the brain at all times. The churchlings recognize neuroscience isn't perfect yet, but it's kind of an optimistic idea. We have their ideas. We have no reason to be optimistic about folk psychology. We do have reason to be optimistic that eventually neuroscience will succeed and give us what folk psychology does not. So does everyone understand just how the argument today went? Just what they were looking to argue, how it fits in, how this was like the idea was we have folk psychology and that's what we generally start with. And there's this other view within the literature which says, no, we need a different starting point and here's why. So one thing I just wanted to do on the semester is kind of put this on the table right at the start and discuss the reasons that some people think it's good and then reasons why most people working in cognitive science are not eliminative materialists. So we'll talk next time about, really the next two classes about, well, next time will be problems with eliminative materialism. And the class after that will be kind of more defense of folk psychology and why using folk psychology as the core of a science is at the very least a good way of beginning. So that's really all I wanted to say this time. Are there any more questions, comments, concerns, feelings, desires, hopes, dreams, any propositional attitudes at all? All right, well, in that case, have a great day and a half. I will see you, or I guess 2 days. I will see you on Wednesday. The reading for that one is just one section of the block and Fodor, and we're just going to be talking about a particular argument, which is this kind of multiple instantiability argument. We probably won't end up using the full class next time either. But that's general background of today, how it's going to tie into next class. All right, I will see everybody on Wednesday. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you, Professor.
Have a good one.
Professor, I just have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like I missed the main point of this paper. You could tell me if I should just reread it again, but I feel like I'm not fully understanding what folk psychology really is.
So this is a great question. So one thing that's tough about folk psychology is, like a lot of folk theories, it's really tough to say like a very clear definition of what it is. It's kind of a weird amalgam of different common sense ideas. So the best way to think of folk psychology is just, what is our common sense understanding of why human beings do what they do and how they go about coming to the conclusions they come to? And so all folk psychology is just a fancy label for common sense. So it's basically just what folk psychology is, and this is like the classic philosophical way of going about things is you take something that's everyday, really common sense, and then you think about it really hard and make it seem incredibly complicated, even though in your everyday life, you're like, this is perfectly simple, I understand it fine. Then you think about it hard. So it's basically, let's start with our common sense understanding of how human beings work and why they do what they do. Now let's try to give a complex theory to kind of capture what is going on with common sense. If we want to explain how common sense works, what do we have to say exists? How do we have to explain how a human being thinks to capture common sense thinking? And so what folk psychology is basically philosophers coming along and saying, all right, common sense works like this. The way we talk, there are things that we all believe, think, desire, and multiple people can stand in relationships to these things, and these things are being true, capable of being true and false. So we start off, if we're going to understand how humans work, we have to first accept that people are capable of thinking and their thoughts have contents that can be true or false, whatever that means. We say that's true, that's false. Let's give it a fancy label. Let's just call it a proposition. This is something that can be true or false. Now, once we know this, and this is just a way of capturing our common sense, because when people are talking their everyday life, one person says, this is what I think, and somebody else says, that's bullshit. That's just how human beings work. That's how we interact. We need something that, like, if we say that's bullshit, what is it that is the bullshit? Well, we need something that is wrong, something that is false, something that is ridiculous, and it needs to be something that you can think and say it's true, and I can think and say it's false, and that's what we just say a proposition is. Now, in our everyday lives, it also seems like those same contents, we can have different relationships to them. It seems in common sense, I can say, I don't believe that. And you can say, I do believe that. Or I wish that was the case, but it's not. Or, I'm not entirely sure, there's a chance that that's the case. So we need some other part to explain it. And so the part we explain is just the attitude. And so all folk psychology is this idea that the vast majority of human behaviors and thinking is to be explained in terms of these contents that can be true or false, leaving open what on earth truth or falsity is. You kind of just wave your hands and say, that the true stuff. And then what are these attitudes? Well, they're the things that generally we start from common sense and we assume that they track closely to what our language has. So which attitudes exist? We haven't done any science yet, so let's just begin by using the words of whatever language we're doing our study in. So in English, we've got a belief. That's one we use a lot. We've got a desire. That's one we talk about a lot. We've got an intention. So that's all that folk psychology really is just you observe how people generally talk about this stuff. And then you say, all right, let's put on our philosophical hats and justify our existence and why we have a department. And now let's think really hard about what people are doing in their everyday lives. And when you do that, it looks like it tracks pretty closely with an English sentence of the form X, attitude, verb, that, content. So that's all it really is. And so this is really the starting point for a lot of psychology. You get into the therapist chair, they say, well, why did you believe that? How did that make you feel? How did that content that you're thinking about impact you and your feelings? And someone like the Churchlands is going to come along and say, that's the wrong place to begin. That's what we're throwing out. We're throwing out basically our common sense way of going about the world. You can keep doing that in your everyday life. You can keep paying your therapist if you want to, but if you want real science and we want real progress, all this has to go out the window. Let's just talk about brains.
You made that very clear.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm glad that was clearer. Any other questions? Alrighty. Well, then in that case, if anyone wants to stick around and ask any more questions, I'm going to shut off the recording now. But otherwise, I'll just stand here and drink some water if anyone wants to ask any more questions.